A freezing bear pleads for shelter. The woman's reaction will leave you speechless. The frigid morning draped Montana's rugged landscape in an eerie silence, so deep it felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. Rachel Davis, cradling her first cup of coffee, gazed out the frost-lined window of her cabin. The thermometer outside read -40 degrees, the coldest day in memory. For the past decade, Rachel had lived alone in this secluded cabin, a retreat from the chaos of city life. She cherished the solitude, the vast expanse of untouched wilderness, and the steady rhythm of the seasons. But on this morning, the silence shattered, a sound so haunting that her mug slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor. It was a cry, sharp, mournful, piercing through the stillness like a blade. Rachel froze, her pulse quickening. In all her years here, she had never heard anything like it. Pulling on her thick winter coat and boots, she stepped onto the snow-covered porch. The air burned against her skin, and her breath curled into frozen clouds that lingered in the stillness. The cry came again, closer this time, and Rachel's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a howl nor a growl, but something in between, a sound filled with desperation. She scanned the horizon where the trees stood like silent sentinels against the pristine white snow. Then her eyes caught something, an unfamiliar shape at the edge of her property, partially buried in the drifts. At first, she thought it was a fallen tree or a large rock, but then it moved. A massive grizzly bear lay there, half submerged in the snow, its thick fur coated in ice. Only its head and one paw were free, trembling slightly as another chilling wail escaped its mouth. Rachel's stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed for her to retreat, yet she stood frozen in place, unable to look away. Then the bear's eyes met hers, locking onto her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. But there was no rage, no unpredictable wildness she had always associated with these formidable creatures. Instead, its gaze was pleading, filled with an intelligence and awareness she couldn't quite comprehend. Rachel hesitated, glancing back toward the safety of her cabin. She had read countless warnings about bears in the wild. Logic told her to stay inside, call wildlife services, and let professionals handle it. But the nearest help was hours away, and she doubted anyone could arrive in time to save the creature. Its labored breaths formed faint plumes in the frigid air, each exhale weaker than the last. Rachel gritted her teeth. Against all better judgment, she decided she couldn't leave it to die. Her breath came in sharp bursts as she trudged through the deep snow, clutching a large pot of steaming water and a metal shovel. The bear watched her approach, its head following her movements with deliberate care. Every step brought a fresh wave of doubt. She was about to stand within striking distance of an apex predator, one capable of ending her life in a heartbeat. Yet the bear remained still, its desperation a tether that kept Rachel moving forward. Reaching the edge of the icy prison, she set the pot down carefully and knelt, her gloved hands trembling as she poured the hot water over the bear's trapped fur. The ice hissed and steamed, tiny rivulets forming along the cracks. The bear flinched but made no sound, its gaze fixed on her in a way that felt disturbingly human. Rachel worked quickly, the freezing air biting at her exposed skin. Each pour of water melted a little more ice, and each stroke of the shovel chipped away the crust that encased the bear. As she worked, she became aware of an odd phenomenon. The snow around the bear had a faint blue tint, almost glowing. At first, Rachel thought it was a trick of the light, but as the ice melted further, the glow intensified, emanating from beneath the animal. Her brow furrowed and she hesitated, her eyes flicking between the bear and the strange luminescence. The creature let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, but something softer, almost coaxing. It lifted its head slightly, gesturing toward the snow with its nose. Rachel swallowed hard, her heart hammering in her chest as she resumed her work. Hour by hour, she chipped away at the ice, the bear's breaths becoming steadier as more of its massive body was freed. Beneath the layers of frost, its fur was thick and glossy, a deep brown that shimmered faintly in the light of the rising sun. Rachel's muscles burned with the effort, and her gloves were soaked through, but she kept going, driven by a strange determination she couldn't explain. When she finally cleared the last of the ice from the bear's body, she stepped back, her chest heaving with exertion. The bear rose slowly, shaking its massive frame, sending a cascade of icy shards flying in all directions. Rachel stumbled back, fear clawing at her throat. This was the moment she had dreaded, the moment the bear would remember its wild instincts and turn on her. But instead, the creature did something that made Rachel's breath catch. It looked at her, deep and unblinking, then shifted its gaze downward, drawing her attention to the ground where the blue glow pulsed softly. Rachel stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Brushing aside the remaining snow, she revealed a metallic surface beneath the bear. It was smooth and cold to the touch, etched with symbols she didn't recognize. A circular outline became visible, 6 feet in diameter, with a faint seam running along its edge. The blue light emanated from tiny grooves in the metal, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. Rachel's fingers hovered over the surface, and she glanced at the bear, which now stood motionless, watching her with an expression that seemed almost expectant. Gathering her courage, she pressed her hand against the center of the circle. A low hum vibrated through the air, and the metal shifted, splitting open to reveal a dark passage leading underground. Warm air rushed upward, startling Rachel as it melted the frost on her cheeks. The bear moved first, stepping carefully onto the revealed staircase. It paused halfway, turning to fix Rachel with a look that sent a shiver down her spine. The unspoken message was clear: follow. Rachel hesitated only a moment before descending after the bear, into the unknown depths below. The air inside the underground passage was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the icy wilderness above. Rachel's boots echoed softly against the metal stairs as she descended, her breath still visible in faint puffs from the chill clinging to her coat. The bear moved steadily ahead, its massive frame unnervingly silent for something so large. Rachel's mind raced, each step deeper into the unknown, amplifying her unease. What kind of door had she just opened? Who or what had built this? And why was a grizzly bear leading her as though it knew exactly where to go? Her fingers brushed against the walls for balance. They were smooth and cool to the touch, the faint hum of machinery vibrating beneath her fingertips. The passage spiraled downward in a slow curve, illuminated by strips of pale blue light embedded in the walls. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but the bear glanced over its shoulder, its gaze steady, as if assuring her she was meant to follow. Against all reason, she kept moving. The staircase ended abruptly, opening into a cavernous chamber that made Rachel stop in her tracks. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into shadow, while the floor stretched out in sleek panels of polished metal. A soft blue glow suffused the space, emanating from geometric patterns etched into the walls and floor. In the center of the room stood a console-like structure, its surface alive with shifting lights and symbols. The bear paused beside the console, nudging it gently with its nose, before sitting back on its haunches. Rachel's breath caught. The deliberate movement seemed less like an animal's instinct and more like an action performed with purpose, a silent invitation for her to step forward. She hesitated, her boots clicking softly as she approached the console. Up close, the patterns on the surface shifted and reformed, creating intricate shapes that pulsed with a rhythmic glow. She reached out tentatively, her hand hovering above the surface before she let her fingertips brush against it. The moment she made contact, a low hum filled the room, and the console came alive. Holographic images sprang into the air, rotating and shifting in a dizzying array of symbols, diagrams, and incomprehensible text. Rachel stumbled back, her heart pounding, but the bear remained calm, its gaze fixed on her as if urging her to look closer. She forced herself to steady her breathing and turned back to the console. The images seemed chaotic at first, a jumble of light and motion, but as she focused, patterns began to emerge. There were maps, familiar outlines of mountain ranges she recognized as the Rockies, and overlays of data she couldn't decipher. Lines of text flowed alongside the images, written in a language that defied understanding. Yet some primal part of her felt that it all carried meaning, if only she could grasp it. The bear rose to its feet, stepping closer to the console. It lifted a massive paw and pressed it against a glowing panel, activating a new sequence. Rachel froze as a series of recordings began to play, projected as three-dimensional images around the room. The first showed a group of bears in a forest, their movements uncannily precise. They worked together to build a structure, their motions coordinated with an intelligence that sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. Another recording followed, this one depicting a group of people in lab coats interacting with the bears. They spoke, gestured, and pointed to diagrams, while the bears responded by mimicking their actions or performing tasks with startling accuracy. Rachel's throat tightened as realization began to dawn. These weren't ordinary animals. They were part of something far bigger, something engineered. The images shifted again, showing diagrams of the bear's anatomy overlaid with complex data. Enhanced neural networks, chemical augmentation, and environmental simulations flashed in rapid succession. The bears had been altered, their intelligence heightened far beyond what nature intended. The recordings painted a picture of a covert program, an experiment conducted in secrecy, buried beneath the mountains. But for what purpose? Rachel's thoughts were interrupted as the room shuddered, a low rumble reverberating through the floor. She grabbed the edge of the console to steady herself, her eyes darting to the bear. It stood still, its ears swiveling toward the sound, then moved swiftly toward a corridor on the far side of the room. Rachel hesitated, but another tremor made the decision for her. She followed the bear, her boots slipping slightly on the smooth surface as she hurried to keep up. The corridor led to a smaller chamber filled with equipment she couldn't begin to understand. Machines hummed softly, their surfaces blinking with lights. The bear moved with purpose, its claws clicking against the floor as it approached a panel on the wall. It pressed its paw against a sequence of buttons, and the room came alive with activity. Rachel watched in stunned silence as screens lit up, displaying more maps and diagrams. One screen showed seismic activity spiking dangerously, red waves rippling across the map of the region. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The tremors weren't just an inconvenience. They were a threat to the stability of this entire facility. The bear turned to her, its gaze piercing. Rachel didn't need words to understand what it was asking. Somehow she had become part of this. She stepped closer to the control panel, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of the symbols flashing on the screen. She touched one, and a new diagram appeared, a map of escape routes leading to the surface. Another screen displayed rows of data that she couldn't comprehend, but instinctively felt were critical. The bear nudged her gently, directing her attention to a glowing lever on the side of the console. Rachel hesitated, her pulse racing, then wrapped her fingers around the lever and pulled. The machinery groaned as a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow passageway leading upward. Warm air rushed past her, carrying the faint scent of soil and pine. The bear wasted no time, heading into the passage with a confidence that suggested it had been here before. Rachel followed, her heart pounding with every step. The tremors grew stronger, shaking the walls as dust and debris rained down from above. She pushed herself to move faster, her legs burning as the incline grew steeper. Just as she thought her lungs would give out, the passage opened into daylight. She stumbled out onto the snow, gasping for air. The bear emerged beside her, shaking off dust and debris. Behind them, the ground trembled violently, and Rachel turned to see the earth collapse in on itself, swallowing the entrance to the facility. The glow of the blue light disappeared, buried beneath tons of rock and snow. Rachel sank to her knees, her mind reeling. The bear stood beside her, its gaze calm and steady despite the chaos. It had led her out, saved her life, and revealed a secret she could barely comprehend. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the only sound the howling wind as it swept across the snow-covered mountains. When the bear finally turned and began walking toward the trees, Rachel watched it go, feeling a strange mix of awe and sorrow. Something profound had happened here, something she would never fully understand. As the bear disappeared into the forest, Rachel stood, clutching the medallion she had taken from the facility, a token of a world she had glimpsed and a bond she would never forget. The world above ground seemed almost too quiet after the chaos Rachel had left behind. The snow-covered expanse stretched out in an unbroken white silence, the wind whispering softly through the pines. She stood for a moment, disoriented by the sudden return to the familiar world, her chest still heaving from the climb. The bear that had guided her from the collapsing facility moved forward steadily, pausing at the tree line to glance back. Its gaze held the same steady intensity that had first compelled her to act, and Rachel felt the unspoken message. It wasn't over yet. Gritting her teeth against the biting cold, she adjusted her coat and followed. Whatever lay ahead, the bear seemed to know the way. The animal's massive form moved through the snow with surprising ease, its fur dusted with frost and its muscles rippling beneath. Rachel struggled to keep up, her legs burning as they navigated a winding trail through the forest. The trees grew denser, their branches heavy with snow, and the air seemed thicker here, almost charged. Her senses prickled as though the landscape itself was holding its breath. The bear led her to a clearing, the center dominated by a strange metallic structure that seemed entirely out of place in the natural setting. It jutted out from the snow like a forgotten monument, its surface tarnished and etched with more of the strange symbols she had seen in the facility below. The structure pulsed faintly with the same blue glow, illuminating the surrounding area in an otherworldly light. Rachel approached cautiously, her boots crunching in the snow. She reached out a tentative hand to touch the metal, and the instant her fingers made contact, a series of lights blinked to life. The structure emitted a low hum, and panels slid open with a precision that made her step back in awe. Inside, the space was small but meticulously arranged, filled with monitors and control panels that buzzed to life in her presence. The bear stood beside her, its eyes scanning the room as if verifying its contents. Rachel's gaze landed on a glowing display in the center of the console, showing a series of red indicators blinking urgently. She didn't need to understand the symbols to know what it meant. The facility's collapse was just the beginning. A holographic image sprang into the air above the console, depicting a vast underground network spanning beneath the mountains. Red lines traced across the map, indicating the areas already compromised by the seismic activity. Rachel's stomach churned as she realized the scale of the destruction unfolding below. Whatever purpose the facility served, it was interconnected with something much larger, and if it failed, the effects could ripple far beyond this remote region. She turned to the bear, her voice hoarse from the cold and the weight of what she had seen. "What do we do?" The absurdity of speaking to the animal struck her only after the words had left her mouth, but the bear's response was immediate. It stepped forward, placing its paw deliberately on a glowing pad. The room shifted around them as new displays illuminated, showing detailed schematics of machinery and structures buried deep within the earth. Rachel's eyes darted across the images, piecing together fragments of what was being shown. It appeared to be a network designed not only to enhance the bear's intelligence, but to integrate them as active participants in environmental protection. The data showed a system for monitoring seismic activity, tracking wildlife migrations, and even mitigating the effects of climate change. The bears were part of it, their heightened cognition enabling them to interact with technology in ways Rachel could hardly comprehend. But the collapse of the main facility threatened to destabilize everything. The system relied on a central power core buried in the mountains, and if it failed, the cascading effect could disrupt ecosystems for miles around. The bear moved to another part of the console, its paw activating a sequence that made Rachel flinch as the structure shuddered slightly. A panel slid open to reveal a cylindrical device glowing with the same blue light as the markings on the walls. It was small enough to carry, its surface smooth and warm to the touch when Rachel picked it up. The holographic map updated instantly, showing a path leading to a point marked with a pulsing blue beacon. Rachel understood. The device was critical to stabilizing the system, and she had to take it to the designated location. The bear nudged her gently toward the opening, its gaze urging her onward. There was no time to question or hesitate. The journey was grueling. The path marked on the holographic map led Rachel and the bear through increasingly rugged terrain, the snow growing deeper and the wind more biting with each step. The weight of the device in her arms seemed to grow heavier, though it emitted a steady warmth that kept her hands from freezing. The bear forged ahead, its powerful strides cutting through drifts that would have swallowed Rachel whole. They climbed steep inclines, crossed icy streams, and navigated narrow ridges where one misstep could have sent them plummeting into the abyss. Rachel's legs ached, her lungs burned, and her thoughts were a swirling mix of fear and determination. She clung to the belief that this mission, however improbable, mattered. not just to her, but to the fragile balance of the world around her. Hours passed, the sky shifting from pale gray to deep indigo as night descended. The beacon on the device grew brighter the closer they came to their destination, its glow illuminating their path through the darkness. At last they emerged onto a plateau, the view opening up to reveal a breathtaking panorama of the mountains. In the center of the plateau stood a towering spire of rock, its surface engraved with more of the strange symbols. A recessed slot at its base matched the shape of the device Rachel carried. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding as she slid the device into place. The spire hummed to life, its blue light intensifying as it sent ripples of energy across the plateau. The ground vibrated beneath her feet, but this time it wasn't the tremors of destruction. It was the system stabilizing, the network reactivating. Rachel stepped back, her breath catching as the light pulsed in rhythm with the mountain itself, as if the land had taken a deep, steadying breath. The bear stood beside her, its eyes reflecting the glow. In that moment, she felt an unshakable connection, as though they were no longer separate beings, but parts of something greater. The bear let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, but a sound of acknowledgement, of completion. As the light settled into a steady glow, Rachel knew their task was done. The bear turned and began to descend the mountain, its massive form disappearing into the shadows. Rachel lingered for a moment, staring at the illuminated spire and the vast, wild expanse beyond. Then she followed, her steps lighter, her heart full of wonder at the bond forged between human and beast in the heart of the mountains. The descent from the plateau was quieter than Rachel had expected, the bear's massive frame moving with a purposeful calm that made her footsteps feel loud in comparison. The light from the spire still pulsed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the impossible events she had just lived through. Every muscle in her body ached, exhaustion threatening to pull her to the ground with each step, but she pressed on, her breath forming short clouds in the biting night air. The snow had stopped falling and the sky had cleared, revealing a brilliant canopy of stars. She kept her eyes on the bear ahead, its powerful form cutting a path through the snow. Something about the creature's deliberate movements filled her with a strange comfort. It had led her this far, through dangers she couldn't have imagined. Whatever this journey had meant, it wasn't finished yet. As they entered the forest, the trees seemed to welcome them, their heavy branches wooing under the weight of snow. Rachel felt a strange shift in the air, as though the very landscape was changing in response to what had happened. The faint hum that had vibrated through the earth earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet so profound it seemed alive. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the blue light of the spire still glowing behind them, but the forest had swallowed everything in shadow. The bear paused briefly, its ears twitching at a distant sound. Rachel stopped, holding her breath as the wind carried a faint vibration through the trees. It wasn't threatening, more like the earth itself was exhaling, settling back into a rhythm that had been disturbed for too long. After what felt like hours of steady walking, the forest opened into a clearing Rachel didn't recognize. Moonlight spilled across the snow, illuminating a scene that sent a shiver down her spine. The clearing was dominated by a massive outcrop of rock, its surface etched with the same symbols she had seen in the underground facility and on the spire. The designs seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight, their patterns shifting almost imperceptibly. Rachel's gaze was drawn to the center of the clearing, where a cluster of bears stood in absolute silence. She counted at least a dozen, their forms massive and imposing in the pale light. They were still as statues, their eyes reflecting the moonlight as they turned toward her and the bear at her side. Her breath hitched, but the bear beside her let out a deep, resonant sound, a low rumble that echoed through the clearing. It wasn't a growl, but a communication, a signal that she couldn't decipher but understood instinctively. The other bears stirred, their movements fluid and deliberate as they turned their attention fully to her. Rachel's pulse quickened as the bear at her side stepped forward, leading her closer to the center of the clearing. She felt like an intruder in a sacred space, her every step a disruption of the stillness that hung heavy in the air. Yet none of the bears moved to stop her. They watched with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and strangely accepted. as though her presence here was not only permitted, but required. The bear guided her to the outcrop, its paw pressing against one of the glowing symbols. The ground beneath her shifted slightly, and Rachel staggered as a panel in the rock slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the space was smaller than she had expected, no larger than a storage room, but its walls were alive with light and motion. Holographic displays filled the air, showing intricate maps of the mountains, data streams tracking wildlife movements, and environmental charts that seemed to pulse with life. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against one of the floating images. It responded instantly, shifting to display what looked like a record of the recent seismic events. The bears had been monitoring everything, their role far more integrated into the ecosystem than she had realized. Rachel's attention was drawn to the center of the room, where a pedestal rose from the floor. On it lay a small medallion, its surface inscribed with the same intricate symbols she had seen throughout her journey. The metal glinted faintly in the light, its edges smooth and worn as though it had existed for centuries. The bear beside her nudged her gently, its nose pointing toward the medallion. Rachel hesitated, her hand hovering over the object. It felt significant in a way she couldn't explain, as though it represented everything she had experienced. The connection, the trust, the inexplicable bond that had formed between her and these creatures. She picked it up, the metal warm against her palm, and a faint hum filled the air. The bears in the clearing responded immediately. They moved as one, their massive forms circling the outcrop in perfect synchronization. Rachel stepped back, clutching the medallion tightly as the hum grew louder. The ground beneath her vibrated, and the holographic displays around her shifted, showing a single glowing line stretching across the mountains. The system had stabilized, its energy flowing through the earth in a way that felt almost alive. The bear beside her rumbled again, its deep voice resonating through the clearing. Rachel felt the sound in her chest, a vibration that seemed to settle something deep within her. The bears stopped moving, their attention shifting back to her. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Then one by one, the bears lowered their massive heads, a gesture that felt unmistakably like acknowledgement. Rachel's throat tightened, a surge of emotion rising as she realized the enormity of what had transpired. These creatures weren't just guardians of the mountains. They were part of something far larger, a connection between nature, humanity, and the very earth itself. The bear beside her moved closer, nudging her gently as if to remind her it was time to leave. She nodded, slipping the medallion into her pocket as she turned back toward the trees. The bears parted silently to let her pass, their eyes following her as she walked. She felt their presence long after the clearing had disappeared from view, their energy lingering in the air like a protective shield. By the time Rachel reached her cabin, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. She stood on her porch, staring out at the snow-covered expanse, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had witnessed. She pulled the medallion from her pocket, its surface catching the morning light. It was a symbol of the extraordinary bond she had formed with the bears and the role she had played in their mysterious mission. As she turned it over in her hands, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for surviving, but for being part of something so much greater than herself. The mountains stood silent and strong in the distance, their peaks glowing softly in the early light, and Rachel knew they were no longer just a backdrop to her life. They were alive, connected, and watching. And somewhere in their vast expanse, the bears would continue their silent work, guardians of a world most would never understand.